So currently there is no breath test for cannabis. There are a number of companies that have been working on this since the earliest days of legalization in Colorado and Washington. But there is no breath test device. The THC molecule tends to want to stick in the tissues in the body. It doesn't come out on a person's breath, so very little of it is exhaled, unlike alcohol, where you can smell alcohol in a person's breath.
This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance. Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast.
The drug is going to work its way through your liver into your brain, and that negative experience is going to last a lot longer. So even though some of these current dosage forms, at least for smoking, are a lot more concentrated, there are many studies that show that people reduce the amount that they're ingesting and really try to tailor it to the experience they're looking for from the drug.
Is that
so I think that
trial and error?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What about urine tests? Are urine tests reliable in any kind of setting?
Okay, so you mentioned the active component of the drug, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And of course, now there are other isomers or related compounds. There's a delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol that there's some debate about what its legal status is. It's openly sold as being legal in malls and in smoke shops.
What when you say delta-8? What do you mean? CBC or something else?
No, so delta-8 is very closely chemically related to delta-9. It's just a difference in one small part of the molecule, one bond in the molecule. It does mean that it doesn't fit as well into the same receptors in the brain as delta-9 does. So delta-8 has about somewhere around 60% of the potency of delta-9, but it just means if you take more of it, you'll achieve the same effect. And then there are
it's probably like light beer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly. So, and then there are probably another half dozen different forms of THC that are now being marketed, being sold. Plants are being bred to express more of these different forms. Some of them are chemically modified. Delta-8 can be made from CBD. That's why there's so much of it currently. So these are the active components of the drug, and we tend to talk about them as the drug. The metabolites are what the body breaks that down into, and some of them have some activity, usually not as much as the parent drug, and some of them are inactive. The major metabolite of THC is carboxy-THC, and carboxy-THC does accumulate in the urine. And as you indicated, it can stay in the urine for a long time. After smoking marijuana in recreational amounts, your urine may test positive for a couple of days afterwards. So a positive urine test, if you're pulled over, doesn't necessarily mean that you're under the influence of the drug at that time, just because the metabolite is in your urine. So the best test really is to demonstrate active use of the drug is a blood test or an oral fluid test.
An oral fluid test, so basically spitting in a cup.
It's a little more sophisticated than that. There are devices now that will collect, it's more like a swab, but will collect about a milliliter of oral fluid that can be tested in labs. And there are 3 or 4 states now that are starting to move away from urine testing over to oral fluid testing to complement blood testing.
Is oral fluid testing as reliable as blood testing, or less reliable, or the same?
So it's about the same, because it tends to give a positive within the same 4 to 6 hour window of use of cannabis, during which a person is likely to experience the psychoactive effects and the effects that could impact their driving. So positivity in blood or an oral fluid, coupled with an officer's observations and opinions about impairment, can complement one another.
So I was never good at science, so I'm just going to clarify for myself and likely for some of my listeners. If someone has a blood test and they are positive for delta 8 and or delta 9, that is an active metabolite, meaning that person is at that time under the influence of cannabis, of marijuana?
Well, so it's an active drug. Are they under the influence? It's going to depend on a number of factors. How much of it did they take, and what is their tolerance, and how long was the sample collected after the driving that's in question in that investigation or case.
But what I guess my question is, if somebody has a delta 8 or delta 9 in their system, does that preclude them from claiming that that's from when I smoked 2 weeks ago? Or does it depend?
It certainly doesn't preclude them from claiming that. As you indicated earlier, there are studies in heavy chronic users of marijuana who stop smoking cold turkey, basically, that their blood can in fact test positive for THC, so the active drug, for a period sometimes of a few weeks. So that has been documented. So people in cases I'm familiar with have certainly claimed that positive result in their blood was a result of historical use rather than recent use.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is either an oral sample or oral fluid sample or a blood test has to be complemented with observations of that individual at the time that they're stopped. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And that's probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's the kind of the gold standard, I would take it, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about observations and observations that these police officers that are drug recognition experts, DREs, make of individuals. The tests that are done. Can you comment or have any thoughts or opinions on whether or not they are generally reliable and or whether or not they need to be further refined?
So the DRE protocol has a couple of different components to it. Some are looking for physiological signs, like changes in blood pressure, changes in pulse, and then the other parts of it are tests of are basically sobriety tests, a little enhanced over what the typical standardized field sobriety test battery looks like. So they're tests designed to disclose the presence of impairment in some of these psychomotor skills, like balance, like ability to listen to and follow instructions, coordination, that are affected by a variety of substances, cannabis and alcohol just being two of them. So they're a way for the officer to assess, is somebody's behavior different from what you would expect to see in a sober person? And of course, the tests are, a person's performance in the test is going to be a function of how recently they used the drug, how much they used, and what their tolerance is. But also, alcohol does produce slightly different kinds of effects from marijuana. And some of the effects on performance from marijuana are not as obvious in the field sobriety tests as would be, for example, the effects for alcohol. So it can sometimes be more difficult for a DRE officer to detect impairment using the standardized field sobriety battery than it is to detect a person who's under the influence of alcohol.
Okay. So, I mean, and I read an article that you had written that you sent to me, and you do note a couple different studies and the different effects on different people related to ability to drive in comparison to individuals who are under the influence of alcohol. And I guess at the end of the day, it seems to me like it just kind of depends. It's going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on the type of cannabis that was ingested, how long prior to driving, etc. Is that an accurate layman's assessment of basically the effects of marijuana and cannabis on an individual?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, the officer's interest is in determining if the person is fit to drive. So they're looking for signs that are different from people who are not under the influence of alcohol or other substances compared to the person that they're evaluating. So there's no definitive sign of marijuana intoxication. In the DRE assessment, there are things that the officer will look for, including this lack of convergence, muscle tremors that might help them differentiate, for example, someone under the influence of alcohol from someone under the influence of marijuana. But it's really the total picture in terms of what they've seen in the person's driving, their interactions with them when they're talking to them after the stop, and then their performance either in the field sobriety tests or in the DRE exam, as they reach their opinion about whether they have the probable cause to suspect impairment and what might have caused that.
You are a world-renowned forensic toxicologist, and you've been studying and researching and writing about this issue of cannabis impairment while driving for a long time, many years. Do you have concerns about the legalization of cannabis and its effect on individuals who are out there driving? I mean, what should a person who makes a decision to ingest cannabis do to ensure that they are not going to be driving while impaired, or is it just going to be an individual type of analysis and wait a certain amount of time? How is the general public supposed to basically self-monitor when it's a little bit different, given everything you've said, than the consumption of alcohol?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very hard for somebody, and that's another thing with respect to the per se levels of 5 nanograms per mil. With alcohol, there's plenty of education. There's cards that are often issued by liquor boards that tell you if you drink this many beers, you're in danger of being over the limit. When you're ingesting a cannabis product, you typically don't know how much THC is in there, so you don't know how much you would have to consume to go over that limit. So it's very hard for the consumer to try to be responsible about their use if they've no way of knowing themselves what their blood level is or how close it is to the legal limit. So there's definitely evidence as marijuana becomes more available, particularly in states that have recreational use, that there is an increase in people who use. And some percentage of them are impaired to the point where it can result in their driving coming to the attention of the police or them being involved in a motor vehicle crash. I mean, just a small change in a person's reaction time, for example, under the right circumstances can make the difference between them crashing and not crashing. So because the number of people who are using the drug is increasing, and some percentage of them are affected in their driving, the number of people who are going to be killed in motor vehicle crashes as a result of the effect of the drug, or at least pulled over by the police, is going to increase. In terms of what somebody can do to be a responsible user of cannabis, I mentioned that time frame of about 4 to 6 hours following recreational use. By that time, the drug has largely left the blood. It's gone into the fatty tissues in the body. There's still some of it in the brain. But people who are recreational users of cannabis are typically familiar with the experience that the effects have largely worn off after about 4 to 6 hours. So the responsible thing to do is not to drive within that time frame, and certainly not to drive if you feel you are affected by the drug.
Now that 3 hour time frame would I would imagine, only apply if someone is inhaling cannabis, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, because the
'Cause if they
time
take an
frame of
edible, it's going to be longer, I would imagine.
that's absolutely right. Yeah, but the time curve for edible consumption can be of the order of 12 to 16 hours.
Understood. What is next, or what is on the horizon for cannabis impairment testing? Several people have asked me. Actually, was at a function yesterday, and a question came up as to whether or not there is any type of product being developed similar to an alco test that would be able to, that would enable law enforcement or even individuals to check and see if they are under the influence of THC such that they shouldn't be driving. And if so, do you think those type of tests are ever going to be deemed reliable?
So currently there is no breath test for cannabis. There are a number of companies that have been working on this since the earliest days of legalization in Colorado and Washington. But there is no breath test device. The THC molecule tends to want to stick in the tissues in the body. It doesn't come out on a person's breath, so very little of it is exhaled, unlike alcohol, where you can smell alcohol in a person's breath. So these technologies do seem to be quite far off if they ever arrive. The interest in having a more rapid chemical test as to whether someone has consumed cannabis has in part led to the increased interest in oral fluid or saliva drug testing, because there are devices that can be taken out into the field and demonstrate that a person has recently used a cannabis product. So that, I think, has driven part of the interest in those technologies. A number of states have implemented statewide programs or studies for the use of that technology. There isn't really any technology or app, for example, that's been demonstrated to have utility for the user in terms of them assessing their fitness to drive. There are a few apps that have claimed that, but none of them have provided evidence that it is a good, reliable, and trustworthy indicator for the user themselves.
Just to conclude, tell us, what you do on a day-to-day basis and how National Medical Services supports private and public entities. You're an expert, so I would imagine that you probably deal with examining samples from both prosecutors and potentially defense attorneys and then testifying about that. Is that accurate? And if so, how could our listeners get a hold of you if they wanted to utilize your services?
So that is the job of a forensic toxicologist. We work in a couple of different areas. We work in support of death investigation testing for coroners and medical examiners. NMS Labs is the largest laboratory in the country doing that kind of testing. And that's where we're looking for evidence of either deliberate or inadvertent exposure, accidental overdoses that may have caused or contributed to a person's death. The other area is what we call human performance toxicology, and NMS's toxicologists oversee testing and review and provide opinions on those cases with respect to the evidence that's available for interpretation in terms of whether a person may be impaired by their drug use. And we do, in fact, do that work for both the defense and the prosecution, and we are happy to review cases for both the defense and prosecution. That's one of the benefits of being an independent lab. Understood.
And where are you located?
Oh, so we're located in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, and you can contact us through our website, which is at www.nmslabs.com.
Great. And we will also have that website and contact information at the bottom of the episode page for this episode on NJ Criminal Podcast. Dr. Logan, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to explain this to me and to our listeners. It is certainly an extremely important topic for attorneys, both prosecutors and defense attorneys, and certainly for lay individuals to have this type of knowledge and know how cannabis does in fact affect an individual's body and their ability to safely operate a motor vehicle. So thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this series. Don't forget to subscribe, because before you know it, we'll be back with another great conversation. If you sell by referral, relationship building, and network marketing, pick a time and let's talk about podcasting. You might be surprised. When done correctly, all you have to do is have the conversations. If you're interested in starting a podcast, visit the contact page at njcriminalpodcast.com and send Meg a message. She'd love to discuss your legal podcast.